Hi and welcome, I'm AnewZ and you are watching Context. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said on Sunday he is ready to meet Russian President Vladimir Putin personally in Istanbul on Thursday for talks on ending the war. The day before, leaders of the so-called Coalition of the Willing met in Kiev and called for a 30-day ceasefire to come into effect starting today. Putin then extended the offer for direct negotiations in Turkey. Following that, the US President Donald Trump said Ukraine should agree to the talks immediately. Meanwhile, Moscow resumed airstrikes on Ukraine after their self-declared 3-day ceasefire elapsed. Berlin has said today that Russia needs to respond to the ceasefire offer by the end of the day or face sanctions. To talk on the latest surrounding the war, we're joined by John Kavalik, senior editor at The Issue Insight, joining us from New York, and political analyst Diogo Castro Silva coming to us from Sao Paulo. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's start with the latest. Germany says that the clock is ticking for Russia to accept the unconditional 30-day ceasefire, threatening sanctions. John, what kind of sanctions could be on the table here and by whom? Only Berlin, the Coalition of the Willing, the EU, or maybe some joint effort with the United States?
There is a 17th sanctions package that is prepared and fairly ready to go from the EU itself. And then, of course, individual countries, even individual members of the EU, do have their own sanction programs that they are allowed to implement. And of course, President Trump has said that the US is prepared to implement sanctions on the Russian Federation as well. And then there are the other countries that are supportive of Ukraine. Some are members of NATO, but not members of the EU, and some are neither members of the EU nor members of NATO. So there is a collective will to ratchet up the pressure on President Putin. And we'll see what happens by the end of business today. But my guess is that President Putin is prepared for those sanctions to be implemented. The bigger question, though, is will he use the implementation of any new sanctions as a reason to call off the meeting on Thursday in Istanbul?
Well, we've heard Trump saying that the talks in Istanbul will bring clarity on whether a deal is possible, and if not, the Europeans and the US can proceed accordingly. Diogo, what do you believe would be the next steps there if a deal seemed impossible?
The next steps will be the continuation of the war as it is. I personally don't see Putin accepting to go to Istanbul. So if you want, Europe and Zelenskyy are calling a double bluff. The bluff of talks of Putin and the bluff of Trump of or not support additional sanctions to Russia. The question the answer we will have by the end of the day, but it seems that as many people expected, Russia is not serious in any conversations. Russia continues to pursue its maximalist goals of subjugation of Ukraine, or failing that, transforming Ukraine into a failed state. Trump played favorably to Russia in the beginning of his mandate by accepting many demands of Russia, but then I think Putin overplayed his hand, and is where we are now. So we are now at the point where we will have or not a decision of Europe of pursuing an additional packet of sanctions, given that Russia is not accepting a ceasefire, and then we will see if the United States will join this effort or not. And if he will, something that Trump has not done since he came to power, which is demand further or structure further aid to Ukraine. Those answers, we will have them shortly.
Well, in the run-up to the possible Istanbul talks, John, would you say that Turkey is the best option here for mediating the talks? And what do you make of Ankara's revived mediating role following those first talks just weeks into the full-scale invasion?
Turkey has the ability to project its location. It's real estate and its location, location, location. So President Erdogan is in a good position. There was a while where the perception was that both the United States and the Russian Federation and Ukraine were attempting to sideline Turkey in favor of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, or another country. But in the end, this is sort of circled back to where it naturally belongs because of Turkey's role with the Black Sea Grain Initiative, Turkey's role at the beginning of the conflict, Turkey's role recently with 2 rounds of US-Russia bilaterals that were held in Istanbul, and that was President Trump, President Putin giving something to President Erdogan. So it makes sense that this happened. And right now, from an optical standpoint, and this is all about optics at this stage, hopefully President Zelenskyy will go regardless of what happens this week and regardless of who from the Russian Federation represents the government of the Russian Federation. Because by President Zelenskyy showing up and standing next to President Erdogan in Istanbul, he gets a tremendous amount of goodwill and a tremendous amount of buy-in to do more in terms of sanctions toward the Russian Federation.
Diogo, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. What do you make of the choice of the venue? What do you make of Istanbul?
Well, I generally concur with John. I think Turkey has a deep interest, of course, in the Black Sea. Erdogan has a deep interest, and this is important for the Ukrainians, of a sovereign and independent Ukraine, because obviously the Black Sea is a core national interest for Turkey, and having Russia overpower Ukraine would put that in danger. On the other hand, Erdogan has a good personal relationship with Putin, although traditionally Turkey is a big rival of Russia, especially in the Caucasus and in the Black Sea. So I think it's the right place, as John said, to hold these talks. The question also is, and I think John is correctly pointing out, is a question of optics. This is all about optics. It's showing who wants, who is not responsible for breaking any peace. Putin thought he had made quite a move by proposing direct talks to Zelenskyy, and then Zelenskyy, I think, very smartly responded that he would be present personally and challenging Putin to do the same. So this is a game of, this is a dance game to show who is responsible and who is not responsible for any peace failure or any peace failure.
When it comes to Ukraine's European allies, 4 leaders met Zelenskyy in Kiev over the weekend, calling for a ceasefire. Putin effectively rejected the offer, instead calling for the direct talks to end the war. John, is the order of steps important here? Could there be any substantial peace talks progress without a ceasefire in place?
It is possible. I think it's important to recognize that neither Ukraine nor Russia are truly excited about negotiating an actual end to the military conflict because, and I know it may sound counterintuitive, but it's not that the deaths and injuries and destruction isn't meaningful. But the resolution of the military conflict is going to mean that both governments are going to accept what they don't want to accept. And it's about how much they're willing to accept that they don't want to accept. This isn't about winner and loser. This is about both sides losing, but to what degree. So the mechanics of the four heads of state and heads of government visiting Ukraine, calling for a ceasefire or else, saying they're going to implement sanctions or else, it really has now been overshadowed by President Putin saying Thursday, the 15th of May, in Istanbul, direct talks with the Ukrainian government. That pretty much steamrolled over everything else in terms of the media narrative, in terms of the optics. And we know that because that's what President Trump grabbed onto. He moved past ceasefire, no ceasefire, it doesn't matter. Go. Zelenskyy, go. Sanctions or not, go. Make it happen. In essence, what Trump is saying, consciously or subconsciously, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, give me a reason, give me political cover to help you more than you think I'm helping Vladimir Putin.
Diogo, would you say that direct peace talks without the cessation of hostilities on the ground be able to produce any results?
No, I don't think so. And I understand the logic behind, in fact, Trump, in a way, forced Zelenskyy to make his move to challenge Putin to go to Istanbul. But I find it hard, even politically, for Zelenskyy to do these talks without a ceasefire. And to be honest, Russia, when it talks about the negotiations, it talks always about the root causes of the conflict. So there is not even talks about ending the conflict. It's all about the root causes, which is the code name for all the grievances of NATO, of European security, of European integration of Ukraine, of denazification, all of these Kremlin talking points. So the thing is, like I said before, when Europe, when the leaders of the European countries went to Kyiv and then they trumped together with Zelenskyy, the objective was to call both bluffs. The bluff that Russia really wanted to engage in any meaningful negotiations, and the bluff on the Trump side of his, which is his personal sympathy towards Putin and Russia, but at the same time, he also has some political flank to cover, because this would mean a total rupture with Europe, and 80 years of shared history are not easily discarded like that, even in the institutional weakness of the United States. So this was a clear move to corner both Trump and Putin. Now, regarding Trump, he's also very, I would say, desperate to see some move on the peace front of these talks, and this is why, in the end, he jumps on these offers, even if they are not meaningful on the Russian side. So you have here a complicated chessboard. I believe Europe will have to act today, otherwise it will lose all credibility. So I believe we will have sanctions on the European side. I agree with John in the sense that everybody then will be watching the 15th, which is where these bluffs are all where the players on the poker table, if you want, will have to put their cards on the table. Will Zelenskyy go? Will Putin go? Will Trump act upon the absence of any Russia effort or not. So this is, I think, where we are heading.
John, you previously touched upon Trump pushing Zelenskyy to go to have cover for further sanctions or other restrictions in the event that the Russians don't want to talk or don't want to put some substantive efforts towards the peace. What sort of tools are left to pressure Russia, not only from the US side? We know about the bill in the Senate, we know about the secondary tariffs Trump has been threatening Russia with. What else is there from Europe?
There continue to be, mostly financial, whether you're sanctioning the so-called shadow fleet of oil tankers that are moving Russian oil throughout the world, whether you're adding a tariff, as President Trump has talked about, 500% on countries buying, potentially buying oil from the Russian Federation, or Iran for that matter, but for the Russian Federation, that would incredibly impact negatively India and China. And as long as President Xi continues the support of the Russian Federation, none of these sanctions are going to be the lightning bolt. They're going to continue to be like a thunderstorm. So the rain keeps falling, but there isn't a moment where lightning strikes and the tree topples over and then it ends. Russia will continue, it's degrading their economic ability to finance the war, the political ability to continue the war internally. But they still are going to be able to inflict an awful lot of damage in Ukraine. And for President Trump, part of the challenge for him in trying to craft what it is he really wants to do to effectuate an end to the war has to do with elasticity. And we've talked about this before, but it has to do with the fact that President Putin is willing to inflict upon Ukraine what Ukraine is not willing to inflict upon Russia, meaning that the armed forces of the Russian Federation will attack apartments, schools, airports, libraries, train stations, civilian targets, hospitals, where President Zelenskyy can't do that. Domestically, his own people won't let him do it, and the countries providing him with military hardware won't let him use it for that purpose. So as long as there's that mismatch, the Russian Federation will continue to do a lot of damage, which pushes from President Trump's standpoint this optic, and he alluded to it or said it again yesterday and today, that young, handsome men continue to die. I want the men to stop dying. And so that's where I think you're going to continue to see him try to navigate and figure out the pressure points he can use with Russia, knowing that there isn't one particular pressure point that he can inflict upon President Putin where President Putin says, no mas, it's over.
Diogo, what are your thoughts on further sanctions? Where could the West hit Russia so that it would hurt, or make Russia come to the table, make some concessions maybe? From the first US-Russia contacts in Jeddah, Moscow asked for easing of some sanctions, primarily in the agriculture and the banking system. What would be the best way forward in your mind?
Well, Moscow is clearly desperate and eager for sanction relief. That is for sure. But there is one instrument in the toolbox that is available to Trump, which is very similar to what happened in Iraq when the U.S. wanted to in a way pacify the country and have a graceful exit, which is a surge. So there is a clear instrument in the toolbox that Trump has not used yet, which is to surge military aid to Ukraine and to show to Russia, which has to be forced into negotiations. People need to understand that Russia will not willingly go to negotiations for many reasons, both internal and regarding the obsession of Putin of subjugating Ukraine. But the question is, so you need to force them. I agree with John that the sanctions will provide incremental deterioration of Russia's position, but there is something more short-term, which is a surge of arms deliveries to Ukraine, giving the Ukraine the means to defend its skies. So, taking out the possibility of these bombardments that Russia has been using, and really show to Russia that long-term, given the industrial base of both Europe and the US, it has to come to the table because it cannot win a military battle. This is something Trump has been reluctant to use. In fact, he has not engaged in any new demands for approval of aid. It contradicts its positions in the campaign and his sympathies for Russia. But if we want to affect the outcome at the short term, this has to come from the military side and really unleashing the necessary armament, which even not Biden, to be honest, did, because President Biden always maintained this policy of giving enough for Ukraine not to lose, but never to win. So really inflict pain in the battlefield to Russia and immunize Ukraine from aerial assaults, which means aerial defense. This, I think, is the shortest path to bring Russia to the negotiating table and really to provide the basis of a ceasefire that can then lead into meaningful peace talks. To be honest, I don't see any other way. And just one final note, more than sanctions now, the price of oil and the weakness of the global economy, which both are linked because we have the price of oil going down, puts an additional pressure to Russia as well. So not only sanctions, but the weakness of the oil price, which now Saudi Arabia seems to be driving quite strongly in terms of maintaining this lower price. So this is an additional factor that brings additional pressure to Russia.
Well, all eyes will be on Istanbul on the 15th. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights and opinions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. That's all we had for you in this edition of Context. Stay tuned to AnewZ.